The voice cut through the frigid English air like a whip crack. "Who the hell touched my plane?" December 1943. Snow drifted in lazy, silent spirals, settling on the hulking, battle-weary frame of a P-47 Thunderbolt. The warhorse's metal skin still radiated a phantom heat, steaming in the cold after its last violent dance over the skies of France. Its pilot, Lieutenant Joe Ringo Haynes, stormed across the icy tarmac, his flight jacket snapping angrily in the bitter wind. A hush fell over the mechanics. All but one. Near the massive tail, a figure caked in grease and grit didn't even glance up from his wrench. "That'd be me," grunted Sergeant Tom Kelly. "She needed a little persuasion to stay in the sky." Ringo stared, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Persuasion? You butchered the damn engine." "Cowling," Kelly corrected, finally looking up and wiping his oil-slicked hands on a filthy rag. His gaze was unnervingly calm. "Manuel said she was overheating." "I fixed the overheating." The pilot's voice rose, sharp with fury. "You can't just carve up a government aircraft like a Sunday roast." Kelly's reply, delivered with glacial calm, froze the very air in their lungs. "Guess I just voided the warranty on a warplane." For a single, suspended heartbeat, there was only the moan of the wind. Then a nervous laugh punctured the silence, but it died a quick death. There was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. Sergeant Kelly had shattered Army Air Force regulations. What he had done wasn't just reckless. It was a court-martial offense. The P-47 had a reputation, and not a kind one. A flying tank. Big, brutish, stubborn, and with a terrifying habit of transforming into a funeral pyre if pushed beyond its limits. Pilots despised it. Mechanics cursed its very existence. But Tom Kelly saw past the flaws. He saw a slumbering Goliath, a monster of pure potential, waiting for a wake-up call. He'd spent his youth under the relentless Oklahoma sun, coaxing life back into rattling tractors and coughing pickup trucks. Machines that were never pretty, but always, always got the job done. To him, the Thunderbolt wasn't a failure of engineering. It was a challenge thrown down by fate. "The Army calls her a fighter," he'd once told a buddy, "but I say she's a sledgehammer. You just have to know how to swing her." The official edict from headquarters had been simple, sterile, and utterly useless. Ground the birds until new parts arrived from the States. Kelly had scanned the supply log, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. 3 weeks for new ducting, he'd muttered to the silent hangar. That's 3 weeks of good men coming home in boxes. So, that night, long after the last engine had sighed into silence and the great floodlights had blinked out, Kelly remained. The cavernous hangar was a cathedral of shadows, smelling of high-octane fuel, cold oil, and the ghost of burnt metal. He climbed the maintenance ladder, a flashlight clenched between his teeth, and with a deep breath began his sacrilege. Every shower of sparks from his cutting torch was a potential ticket to a military prison. Every clang of his wrench against the government-issued steel echoed like a treasonous confession in the emptiness. He didn't care. He wasn't chasing a medal. He was fighting a quiet, desperate war to keep his friends from falling out of the sky. Dawn found him still there, his eyes raw and bloodshot, his hands a roadmap of fresh cuts and burns. He had reshaped the cowling with the stubbornness of a sculptor, rerouted the choked air ducts, and welded a makeshift baffle from scrap aluminum scavenged from a Spitfire's corpse. The result was hideous, a Frankenstein's monster of a fighter, as if he'd grafted a plowshare onto a thoroughbred. But the instruments didn't care about beauty. When he hit the starter, the massive Pratt & Whitney engine didn't just start. It roared to life. Not the usual choking asthmatic growl, but a deep, clean and hungry bellow. The temperature needle held steady, cool and unwavering. No ominous wisps of smoke, no scent of scorched metal. Kelly slumped against the plane's cold fuselage, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. He patted the rugged skin with a grimy hand. "You're not a jug," he whispered. "You're a bull." The next morning, Lieutenant Ringo Haynes would take that very plane across the channel. What happened next would forge the P-47 Thunderbolt into a legend and brand. Tom Kelly as the most dangerous kind of hero, the one who didn't wait for permission to change the course of the war. Before Kelly's illicit surgery, The P-47 was the punchline of every briefing tent from London to Sussex. Pilots derisively called it the Jug, short for juggernaut, but most said it stood for a flying milk jug. It was a colossal, heavy beast, sluggish at the low altitudes where dogfights were a ballet of death. It couldn't climb fast enough to intercept a Messerschmitt, and it couldn't turn sharply enough to evade a Focke-Wulf. To the men strapping themselves into its cockpit, the Thunderbolt felt less like a fighter and more like a flying coffin. "Every time I take her up," one pilot was overheard muttering, "I feel like I'm riding a cast-iron safe with wings." Even the enemy scoffed. Luftwaffe intelligence reports mockingly dismissed it as an aircraft better suited for hauling dairy than for combat. The sleek, predatory Bf-109s and FW-190s of the Reich could dance through the clouds with lethal grace. The Thunderbolt just bludgeoned its way through the air, a loud, unrefined and inefficient brawler. But to Tom Kelly, that brute strength was its salvation. He was a son of the Dust Bowl, where nothing ever worked as it should. Tractors died daily. The wind screamed through the cracks of a dying farmhouse. When the Depression swallowed everything, his father lost their land. But Tom never lost the instinct to fix what the world had written off. "If it moves," he'd say, "it can fight." So when the draft notice came, and he found himself in the Army Air Forces, he didn't see the P-47's flaws. He saw raw, untamed potential. An engine with the power to lift a mountain, wings that could shrug off cannon blasts, and a fuselage forged like a steel anvil. All it needed was for someone to unshackle it. The airflow simply had to match the thunderous heartbeat of its horsepower. Still, the chorus of despair was a daily trial. Pilots called the Jug a death sentence. Mechanics grumbled that even a simple oil change required the strength of 3 men and a divine miracle. And from headquarters, buried under an avalanche of red tape, came endless memos preaching strict, blind adherence to the design parameters. Kelly filed most of them directly in the nearest bin. He'd read the technical manuals cover to cover. He knew what the engineers in their warm, safe offices thought the plane could do. But those men weren't the ones fighting for oxygen at 20,000 feet, watching tracers arc past their canopy. The regulations screamed, "Do not modify the intake ducts." But Kelly's gut, an instrument honed on the Oklahoma plains, screamed back that those very ducts were a noose around the engine's throat. The clash between the pristine rulebook and the bloody, oil-stained reality was the central truth of life on the airfield. For the men of the 56th Fighter Group, under the command of the formidable Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, the pressure was a physical weight. Their mission was clear: stop the Luftwaffe from butchering the Allied bomber streams. But their own aircraft seemed to be conspiring against them. The official solution was always the same: wait for replacement parts. But by the time a shipment arrived, another mission would be etched into the loss reports, and another pilot would be nothing more than a name on a missing-in-action telegram. One frigid morning, a shot-up Thunderbolt shuddered back to base, its engine gasping its last breath. It didn't land so much as collapse onto the tarmac. The ground crew gathered around the crippled bird, their faces grim. The engine cowling was a horror show, melted and warped by unimaginable heat, the turbocharger seals blown to oblivion. "She wasn't flying," a mechanic murmured, his voice hollow. "She was dying in the air, piece by piece." Kelly didn't offer empty words. He simply stepped forward and laid a hand on the scorched metal. He could feel the story of its failure in the blistered paint and twisted aluminum, a tale of choked airflow and a beast starved of breath. In his mind's eye, the solution ignited, clear and complete. That night, while the squadron slept fitfully, he began his rebellion. Not with a wrench, but with a grease pencil. On the vast empty canvas of the hangar wall, he sketched his vision: widened ducts like opened arteries, redirected airflow paths, and a custom baffle. Its design borrowed from the elegant, scavenged bones of a fallen Spitfire. The principle was brutally simple: feed the beast more air, and it will fight longer. To any officer, it was heresy. To Kelly, it was the only arithmetic that mattered. "The Jug's not a joke," he whispered to the shadows, his final line striking across the diagram with decisive force. "It's a hammer, All it needs is a better handle. And in that solitary moment, Tom Kelly made the conscious, calculated decision to commit the one sin every mechanic was drilled never to commit: to break the sacred rules of war and the fundamental laws of engineering. To understand the man who would dare to rewrite the Thunderbolt's destiny, you had to go back to the sun-baked flatlands of Oklahoma. Before he was a legend, Tom Kelly was just a grease monkey, born in 1915, forged in the crucible of the Dust Bowl, a world where machines were the difference between survival and starvation, and dreams were a luxury no one could afford. His father was a magician with tractors, patching together miracles for farmers who could barely afford fuel. Young Tom's childhood was spent with his hands deep in engine grease, his world defined by the music of turning wrenches and the scent of gasoline. When he wasn't fixing engines, he was testing their limits, racing battered jalopies down dirt roads, building an innate, visceral understanding of speed, power, and the precise moment metal would scream in protest. "You don't need blueprints," he'd often say, "when you can feel how the engine breathes." That instinct, the uncanny ability to listen to a machine's soul, was what set him apart. When America was plunged into war in 1941, Kelly didn't enlist for patriotism or glory. He joined for a single, straightforward reason. He wanted to fix airplanes. "Every man's got a talent," he'd told the recruiter, without a hint of boastfulness. "Mine's making things work when they've got every reason to quit." By 1943, he was stationed with the 56th Fighter Group, the outfit that would soon become feared across Europe as Zemke's Wolfpack. The airfield was a chaotic, muddy purgatory of tents and corrugated steel hangars. Days began and ended with the acrid perfume of aviation fuel and burnt oil. Mechanics worked 12-hour shifts in a cold, so biting their skin would stick to frozen metal. Yet complaints were rare. They weren't just maintaining machines, they were stitching together the thin margin between life and death for the men who flew them. Kelly quickly earned a reputation as the man who didn't wait for permission. A failed engine? He'd tear it apart. A jammed radio? He'd rewire it with scavenged parts. Once, when a flight leader's landing gear refused to lower, Kelly drove a jeep onto the active runway, a blowtorch in hand, and freed the stubborn mechanism as the aircraft hovered on a whisper of fuel above him. The shaken pilot later said, "That man's got ice water in his veins, where the rest of us have nerves." But Kelly wasn't fearless. He was fueled by a quiet, simmering fury. A fury at the bureaucratic stupidity that let men die. "You can't fight a war with perfect paperwork," he'd grumble to his fellow mechanics. "You fight it with spit, steel, and whatever the hell works." He didn't see airplanes as mere assemblies of parts. To him, they were living, breathing entities, each with its own temperament. "Some birds are stubborn," he'd say. "You got to talk them into flying." When the first P-47 Thunderbolts arrived, the pilots saw a clumsy brute. The engineers saw a design they called operationally sufficient. Kelly saw an unfinished masterpiece. Every time a Thunderbolt limped home, trailing smoke and shame, Kelly would be the first to crawl inside its wounds, reading the bullet holes like Braille, tracing heat patterns, even smelling the oil to diagnose its sickness. "Machines leave clues," he'd tell the wide-eyed rookies. "You just have to know how to listen." This obsessive dedication won him the unwavering trust of the pilots, but marked him as a dangerous rogue in the eyes of command. To the officers, he was a loose cannon, a sergeant who questioned every directive. "Sir," he once said to an inspecting captain, "you can follow the manual all you want, but that manual ain't never stared down a Focke-Wulf." The captain had frowned, correcting him. "Neither have you, Sergeant." A faint, knowing smile had touched Kelly's lips. "No, sir, but I've fixed the planes of the men who have." By the bitter winter of 1943, frustration was the mother tongue of the 56th. Every sortie seemed to end the same way, with the sickening sight of a P-47 streaming smoke or, worse, an empty space in the formation where a friend used to be. A vicious cycle of blame ensued. Pilots accused the mechanics cursed the engineers, and the engineers, safe in their offices an ocean away, blamed improper maintenance under combat conditions. The real truth was a mechanical tragedy. The Thunderbolt's massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, a powerhouse on the drafting table, was being slowly strangled in the sky. Its complex turbocharger system became a furnace under pressure. Oil seeped into places it had no business being. Pilots who pushed their birds to climb, to reach the fight, were rewarded with a terrifying sight, the temperature needle spiking into the red, followed by a final sickening cough from the engine, and then silence. The grim ritual became a familiar sight at the airfield, the silent, powerless glide of a P-47, its engine dead, scraping onto the runway in a shower of desperate sparks. Another one's cooked, the ground crews would mutter, their voices a mixture of resignation and rage. For Tom Kelly, the sight was a personal indictment. He had seen enough. The root problem wasn't the engine's heart. It was its lungs. The ducts feeding the supercharger were anemic, and the cowling trapped heat like a blast furnace. It was a design born in a sterile laboratory, not the crucible of combat. The memory of Lieutenant Ringo Haynes stumbling out of his cockpit last week, his face pale after his oil pressure plummeted to nothing, was seared into his mind. Examining the wreck, Kelly saw the same gruesome signature: baked metal, blistered wiring, coolant boiling over like a witch's cauldron. "They're dying of thirst," he growled at his crew, kicking a toolbox that skittered across the concrete. Engines need to breathe, and this one's being choked with a pillow. A young, anxious mechanic named Franks looked up, his voice trembling. "But Sarge, the manual says we can't touch the ducting without a requisition order from command." Kelly fixed him with a stare that could freeze fire. "Son, did that manual ever have to watch a man burn to death because his turbo line seized up at 20,000 feet? The silence that followed was heavier than any tool in the hangar. The Army Air Force's regulations were crystal clear. Unauthorized modifications were a cardinal sin. Every aircraft was sacred government property. To alter one was to invite a court-martial. But to Kelly, rules drafted by men who had never heard the shriek of flak or the rattle of a machine gun weren't laws. They were a death sentence for his friends. That night, he returned to the hangar long after the last sentry had passed. The vast space was a tomb, silent except for the groans of the corrugated steel walls contracting in the cold. He set his battered coffee thermos on a wing, pulled a well-worn wrench from his pocket, and began his operation. He stripped away the front cowling, exposing the Thunderbolt's heart, a monstrous radial engine. A tangled web of tubes, wires, and steel. He knew its anatomy better than his own, but tonight he wasn't a mechanic. He was a surgeon performing forbidden medicine. With a hacksaw, he carved into the aluminum skin, widening the intake's throat. Then, using salvaged tubing from a Spitfire's corpse, he rerouted the airflow, creating a bypass around the supercharger's heat trap. Finally, with the grim satisfaction of a farmer solving a problem, he riveted a crude, handmade baffle near the exhaust, a trick he'd once used on a tractor engine back in Oklahoma. The result was brutal, ugly, a complete and utter mutilation of government property. As dawn bled into the sky, he sat back on the wing, his body caked in grime and sweat, and stared at his creation. The once sleek fighter now sported an asymmetrical, bulging scar on its flank. It looked like a wounded beast, patched up and angry. Kelly didn't care about aesthetics. He cared about one thing: would it live? The next morning, the airfield was electric with gossip about Kelly's rebellion. His crew whispered that the sergeant had finally snapped. Even Ringo Haynes, the man who owed Kelly his life, thought he'd crossed a line. "Tom," Ringo said, pulling him aside, his voice low with concern. "You know they'll hang you for this, right? They'll make an example of you." A slow, defiant grin spread across Kelly's face. "Maybe, but they'll hang me with a wrench in my hand, not a rule book." Later, the modified P-47 sat on the tarmac, looking alien and out of place in the weak winter sun. But when a mechanic hit the starter, the engine didn't just start, it purred. The sound was new, a deep, confident, rumbling baritone that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Kelly took a step back, his voice barely a whisper. "Let's see if breaking the rules can keep men alive." It would. And the skies over Europe would soon bear witness. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Kelly's commanding officer, Major Connors, stormed into the hangar, his face a thundercloud. "What in God's name did you do to that aircraft, Sergeant?" Kelly stood at rigid attention, a smear of oil on his cheek. "Improved it, sir. Improved it." The Major barked, circling the P-47 as if it were a mutilated body. "You butchered it! You violated Section 42 of the Maintenance Code and half the damned Army Air Corps regulations." Kelly didn't flinch. "And I might have saved a few lives while I was at it, sir." The Major opened his mouth to deliver the crushing reprimand, but the words were stolen by a sound that erupted through the hangar. One of the mechanics, unable to contain his curiosity, had climbed into the cockpit and hit the starter. The R-2800 engine roared to life. This wasn't the usual uneven, asthmatic sputter. It was a deep, steady, hungry thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. The sound was a physical force, vibrating through the concrete floor and into their bones. Every man in the hangar froze. All eyes darted to the gauges. The readings were perfect. Oil pressure, rock steady, temperature needle cool and calm. Kelly's ugly ducting was feeding the turbocharger a rich, clean breath of air. Even the exhaust shimmer was a cleaner, hotter blue. Major Connors just stared, his professional fury warring with undeniable shock. "You're lucky this works, Sergeant," he finally managed, his voice losing some of its edge. "You're still going to have to explain yourself to command." Kelly nodded. "Yes, sir. But first, let's get it tested where it counts." He looked up through the hangar doors at the vast gray sky. Up there, the test flight came sooner than anyone expected. Lieutenant Ringo Haynes, the hot-headed pilot who had nearly been a casualty of the old design, volunteered to take the monster up. "If it explodes," he joked, his smile grim, "I'll haunt you for eternity." Kelly smirked. "Deal, just don't stall her. She's temperamental until she knows you mean business." When Ringo climbed into the patched-up cockpit, the entire airfield seemed to hold its breath. The plane looked ridiculous, a Frankenstein's monster of mismatched metal. But when Ringo pushed the throttle, the aircraft didn't just accelerate, it leapt. The wheels left the earth in half the usual distance. The modified Thunderbolt climbed, not like the lumbering jug they knew, but like a predator, slicing through the English overcast with raw, aggressive power. The radio crackled to life, Ringo's voice laced with disbelief. "Temp steady at 10,000. 15,000. 20,000 feet. No overheating." Jesus, Kelly, she's smooth as silk. "I've never flown anything like this." The hangar erupted in a wave of cheers and shouts. Even Major Connors couldn't suppress a grudging grin. But Kelly didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He simply exhaled a breath he felt he'd been holding for months. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this wasn't the end of his troubles. It was only the beginning. Word spread through the base like wildfire. Mechanics were already begging for a look at his grease pencil schematics. Pilots started lining up, demanding their planes get the Kelly mod. And the officers? They watched the commotion with mounting dread, knowing that one man's miracle had just thrown their entire rulebook out the window. The confrontation in the hangar was inevitable. The Major of Engineering, a man whose world was defined by manuals and flowcharts, finally cornered him. "Sergeant Kelly," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "let me be perfectly clear. You are not authorized to make changes to combat aircraft." Kelly didn't look away. He met the officer's gaze, his own eyes reflecting the flickering hangar lights. "Then authorize it, sir." The Major's frown deepened. "You think this is a democracy, Sergeant?" Kelly's voice, usually a low rumble, hardened to tempered steel. "No, sir. I think it's a war." For a week, his future dangled over the abyss of a court-martial. But Kelly didn't wait for a verdict. He became a ghost in the machine, working in the silent, shadowy hours. Whenever a Thunderbolt came in for maintenance, he performed his illicit ritual. He didn't log the changes. He didn't seek approval. He simply let the metal breathe, carving his defiance into intake ducts and cowlings, one aircraft at a time. By the time the brass realized his infection had spread through half the fleet, the evidence was undeniable. The P-47s with the Kelly mod were performing miracles. Fewer engine failures, blistering climb rates, and engines that ran cool under hellish strain. The Air Force had a dilemma it couldn't ignore. You can't court-martial success. A month later, a memo from headquarters quietly circulated. Field Maintenance Modification K1 approved for continued evaluation. In the cryptic language of the military, it was a white flag. It meant, don't ask who started it, but for God's sake, keep it going. Tom Kelly didn't need a medal. His reward was the deep, confident purr of a Thunderbolt returning to base, its pilot alive and unharmed. That sound was his symphony of victory. 2 weeks later, Kelly's illegal fix faced its baptism by fire. It was March 1944, and the 56th Fighter Group was assigned to shepherd a daylight raid over the heart of the Reich. Industrial complexes near Hanover, the very factories that pumped life into the Nazi war machine. The Luftwaffe was waiting. As the vast armada of B-17s droned past 20,000 feet, the Thunderbolts, a mix of Kelly's modified birds and stock models, swarmed around them like angry hornets. Among them was Lieutenant Ringo Haynes, strapped into the very same patched-together P-47 that had started it all. Back at the airfield, Kelly stood on the tarmac, the cold wind biting through his jacket, staring at the horizon long after the last engine note had faded into the vast, silent sky. He knew the hell they were flying into, a maelstrom of flak that blackened the air and the sleek, predatory shapes of enemy fighters. And he knew, with a stone in his gut, that if his fix failed, the blood would be on his hands. Hours later, the command post radio crackled to life, shattering the agonizing silence. The battle reached them in broken, static-laced fragments, a terrifying tapestry of combat. Bandits. 12 o'clock high. Messerschmitts everywhere. Red 2's hit. He's pulling up. He's climbing. This Thunderbolt's running hot. Wait. Temps dropping back. She's holding steady. Kelly froze. That last voice was Haynes. For 30 minutes, the airwaves were a chaotic symphony of gunfire, shouted warnings, and desperate prayers. The Luftwaffe had thrown its best at them. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts slashed through the formations in deadly, coordinated attacks. At one critical moment, Haynes's wingman took a direct hit and spun away, trailing fire. Enraged, Haynes rolled his heavy fighter inverted and stood on the throttle, pursuing the German who had delivered the killing blow. Under such an extreme, sustained climb, a standard P-47's engine would have boiled over into catastrophic failure. But not this one. Engine's cool, Kelly. Haynes's voice shouted over the din, exhilarated. Cool as the other side of hell! He closed the distance, lined up the enemy fighter in his sights, and squeezed the trigger. A 2-second burst from his .850 caliber machine guns tore the Focke-Wulf apart, painting the sky with a brief, violent sun. Back at the base, the hours crawled. Mechanics smoked cigarettes down to the filter. Officers pretended to study maps. Kelly just sat on a fuel drum, his entire being focused on the horizon, waiting for a sound. Then he heard it. A low, confident rumble growing in the distance. One by one, the Thunderbolts returned. Some were scarred, wings holed, some trailing faint plumes of smoke, but they were alive. When Haynes taxied to a stop, Kelly was already there, sprinting alongside the wing. The canopy swung open, revealing Ringo, his face smeared with sweat, oil, and a triumphant, wild grin. She flew like she wanted to fight, he yelled over the dying engine. Didn't overheat, didn't even sputter. I outclimbed 2 190s and sent one straight to Valhalla. Kelly just nodded, a lump in his throat robbing him of words. For the first time in months, the tremor in his hands wasn't from fury. It was from a profound, bone-deep relief. The after-action report was unequivocal. Every single P-47 with Kelly's modification had returned. 2 of the unmodified Thunderbolts, however, had been lost to engine failure during the same brutal engagement. The difference was no longer theoretical. It was written in the cold, hard math of survival. When the results landed on the desks of High Command, they didn't send congratulations. They sent an order. Field Modification K1, approved for immediate standardization across the 8th Air Force. Kelly's court-martial offense had just become official doctrine. In the weeks that followed, bomber crews began to notice. The Thunderbolts guarding them stayed longer, fought harder, and climbed with a ferocity that shocked the enemy. Luftwaffe intelligence reports now spoke of the P-47 with a new, wary respect, noting their abnormal endurance and cooling efficiency. That night, the mechanics threw a raucous celebration in the hangar. The air was thick with the smell of cheap beer, engine oil, and unbridled joy. Ringo Haynes raised a bottle high. "Tom!" he shouted, his voice echoing. "You didn't just fix a plane, brother. You fixed the damn odds." Kelly accepted the bottle but didn't drink. He just offered a faint, weary smile. "All I did," he said softly, "was let her breathe." By April 1944, the results of the Kelly mod were a torrent of undeniable success. P-47 squadrons equipped with his redesign were posting stats that made other groups green with envy. Plummeting failure rates, soaring sortie completion, and endurance that stretched the very limits of the possible. Pilots were returning from the deepest penetrations into enemy territory, with fuel and fight still left in them. But victory casts a long shadow, and success attracts the spotlight of scrutiny. One grey, rain-swept morning, Kelly was summoned to headquarters. He walked into a small, sterile room with olive-drab walls and a single wooden desk. 3 stern-faced officers sat waiting, their expressions unreadable, their folders thick with paperwork that held his future in its pages. The room in headquarters was stifling, the air thick with the scent of old paper and authority. 3 colonels sat in judgment, their faces carved from granite. "Sergeant Kelly," the lead colonel began, his voice a low rumble, "we've reviewed your maintenance reports. Or rather, the conspicuous lack of them. You have made numerous, unauthorized, and radical alterations to multiple government aircraft. Do you deny this?" Kelly stood at parade rest, his gaze steady, meeting the colonel's eyes without flinching. "No, sir. I don't deny it." "Then you understand the gravity of your actions? The precedent it sets?" "Yes, sir," Kelly replied, his voice calm but firm. "But I also understand that those planes are coming back now, and the men flying them are still breathing." A heavy silence descended, broken only by the nervous tap of a pencil and the rustle of paper as another officer flipped through a damning report. Finally, the lead colonel leaned back in his chair, the stern lines of his face softening by a fraction. "You realize this kind of initiative, while yielding admirable results, cannot be officially encouraged. We can't have every mechanic in the Air Force playing mad scientist with million-dollar equipment." Kelly remained silent. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. His madness was winning the war. The colonel sighed, a sound of bureaucratic surrender. "You'll receive a formal reprimand in your file. It will note your insubordination." He paused, and a small, genuine smirk touched his lips. "But off the record, Sergeant, good work. Keep saving our boys. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't glory, but it was permission." That night, he returned to the hangar, his body weary but his spirit lighter than it had been in months. The men swarmed him, their faces etched with anxiety. "They court-martial you, Sarge?" Franks asked, his voice trembling. Kelly shook his head. "Not yet. They just told me to stop doing what I'm doing." "So, you're stopping?" another mechanic ventured. A slow, defiant grin spread across Kelly's face. "Didn't say that either." The resulting laughter was a release of pure, unadulterated joy. For the first time, the hangar felt less like a workshop and more like a forge where history was being hammered out on the anvil of necessity. In the following months, Kelly refined his modification, now with the quiet, unspoken blessing of command. The Air Force never credited him. Instead, field manuals began to include his airflow adjustments under the sterile heading of Recommended Field Adaptation, K1. It was bureaucracy's way of swallowing its pride and saying, "We need this, but we'll never admit where it came from." Then the letter arrived. It was from the United States, sealed and marked confidential. It wasn't from the Army. It was from Pratt & Whitney, the creators of the mighty R2800 engine. Someone in the chain of command had quietly forwarded his designs. The letter thanked him for his invaluable field insights that had directly improved the engine's operational reliability. Enclosed was a check for $200 and a signed note from a chief engineer that read, "It seems sometimes the best engineers wear grease, not ties." Kelly folded the letter with care and tucked it into his jacket pocket, right over his heart. He never cashed the check. By the summer of 1944, the Kelly fix was standard across Thunderbolt units. The results were staggering. Mission success rates soared, and combat losses from mechanical failure became a rarity. Word filtered up to the highest echelons. A visiting general asked a group commander, "Who the hell finally figured this damn plane out?" The commander just shrugged. "Just a sergeant, sir. One who apparently doesn't like reading manuals." The general barked a laugh. "Good. Maybe we need a few more of those." Kelly never heard about the exchange. He was too busy, sleeves rolled up and face streaked with oil, buried in the guts of another engine, humming to himself as the thunder of his creations echoed outside. To him, the war wasn't about glory. It was about work done right, even when no one was watching. By the end of 1944, Kelly's reputation had become a quiet legend. Pilots across England spoke of the jug that could now outclimb and outlast the enemy. Mechanics from other squadrons wrote letters addressed simply to the breather, asking for his secrets. But his ultimate test came on a freezing December morning. As Hitler launched his desperate surprise in the Ardennes, a massive bombing run was ordered into the teeth of the storm. The weather was brutal, the sky a cauldron of flak and cloud. Every man who climbed into a cockpit knew the odds. Kelly worked through the night in the ghostly glow of hurricane lamps, his fingers numb, tuning engines with a surgeon's touch. A young pilot from Kansas, barely 20 years old, came to check on his plane. Kelly looked up from the engine block, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "She'll bring you home," he stated, his voice leaving no room for doubt. The young pilot managed a weak smile. "You sound awful sure." Kelly tightened a final bolt. "I don't gamble." At dawn, the airfield trembled as hundreds of Thunderbolts tore down the runway and vanished into the grim horizon. Kelly stood, hat pulled low, watching them go. The mission was pure chaos. German fighters swarmed the bombers. The radio network became a bedlam of panic and courage. Bandits at 5 o'clock. "Engines hit. I'm losing oil pressure." "Wait, she's stabilizing." "Kelly, she's still running." Hours later, the first planes returned, battered, scorched, and beautiful. The young pilot from Kansas taxied in, smoke pouring from a wounded wing. He jumped from the cockpit, tears cutting clean lines through the grime on his face, and embraced a stunned Kelly. "She took a cannon shell in the manifold," he sobbed. "Any other bird would have blown apart. But yours—" "She just kept flying." Kelly simply patted his back, a faint smile on his lips. "Told you I don't gamble." The after-action report confirmed the miracle. Every single P-47 modified with Kelly's design had returned. Not one had been lost to catastrophic engine failure. In a war that consumed lives by the thousands, a handful of men had cheated death because one mechanic refused to believe the rulebook was more important than their lives. In the weeks that followed, the pilots began to mark their aircraft with a small, simple symbol, a single stylized lung painted near the cockpit, a silent tribute to the man who taught a beast to breathe. A crude wrench was painted beneath the cockpit. It wasn't official, wasn't even regulation. But among the Thunderbolt crews, it meant something simple. This plane had been touched by Kelly's hands. Even the brass took notice. When a visiting general inspecting the base asked about the strange marking, a pilot explained its meaning. The general just nodded and said, "Keep him in the hangar then. He's worth a squadron." As the war drew to a close, Kelly was offered a transfer to an engineering division in London, a dream posting for most enlisted men. Offices, clean uniforms, and no more freezing nights on the tarmac. He turned it down. "They've got plenty of officers in London," he told his commanding officer. "What they don't have are enough mechanics who care." When victory finally came, the 56th Fighter Group assembled for one last formation flight. As the Thunderbolts roared overhead in perfect symmetry, Kelly stood alone by the runway, head tilted back, listening. To everyone else, it was just the sound of engines. To him, it was the sound of everything he'd worked for, proof that machines could have souls, that rules could bend for the right reasons, and that one act of defiance could change a war. He reached into his pocket and unfolded a grease-stained note that Haynes had given him after their last mission. In shaky handwriting it read, "We flew higher because you broke the rules." Kelly folded it carefully, slipped it back into his jacket, and smiled. The junk plane had become a legend, and so had the man who fixed it. When peace settled over England in 1945, the once thundering runways grew silent, Mechanics packed their tools. Pilots signed transfer papers. And Kelly found himself standing before the same hangar door where it had all begun. For the first time in years, he had no plane to fix. One afternoon, the squadron commander handed him discharge papers with a simple line. "You've done your duty, Sergeant. Time to go home." Kelly looked around, the empty hangar, the fading oil stains, the lingering scent of fuel. This had been his world since before Pearl Harbor. "Home," he murmured. "Guess I forgot what that looks like." The trip back across England, then across the Atlantic, was eerily quiet. No engines to tune, no missions to prep, just endless ocean and the uneasy calm that follows years of noise. When he finally stepped off the ship in New Jersey, he was met not by fanfare, but by the hum of a rebuilding nation. Factories that once built engines for war now turned out cars and tractors. The same lines that had fed his beloved Thunderbolts were now powering peacetime America. Months later, a letter arrived from Major Robert Cowboy Haynes in Texas. "Kelly," it read, "they're putting your fix in the post-war P-47 manual. He says it improved airflow by 7%. The boys are saying you saved more pilots than half the generals combined." "Thought you'd want to know." Kelly laughed, not at the praise, but at the irony. The very modification that had once earned him a reprimand was now official doctrine. The new manual read, "In field conditions, mechanics are authorized to apply adaptive cowling baffles and modified oil cooler ducting per field experience reports." It didn't bear his name, but everyone who knew the story understood who field experience meant. After the war, Kelly worked briefly at a civilian aircraft company in Ohio. They offered him an office job, but he quit after 2 weeks. "I belong near engines," he told the foreman. He returned to the shop floor, surrounded by grease-stained men with calloused hands and stories like his own. From time to time, young mechanics would gather around him to hear tales of the war. One asked, "Sergeant, is it true you broke regulations to save those planes?" Kelly grinned. "Kid, I didn't break them, I just read between the lines." He never married, never sought fame. Yet every Christmas, veterans from his old squadron sent him cards marked with a small symbol, a wrench beneath a pair of wings. By the 1950s, his wartime modification had quietly shaped the design of new jet engine cooling systems. Engineers cited field-tested adaptations in their research papers. No name, just legacy. Kelly didn't mind. He'd never cared about credit, only results. One evening, sitting on his porch, he heard the distant rumble of a jet streaking overhead, sleek, silver, and impossibly fast. He smiled. "Different engine," he whispered. "Same principle." He sipped his coffee, looked toward the sky and said softly, "If she flies, I did my part." And somewhere in a museum in England, a restored P-47 Thunderbolt bears a small engraving on its engine cowling, dedicated to the unnamed mechanic who made her breathe again. Its paint was faded, its wings patched, but its heart, the great Pratt & Whitney R2800, was still intact. During restoration, a volunteer discovered something unexpected inside the cowling. A small piece of aluminum, etched with faint letters beneath decades of grime. It read simply, "Keep her breathing." Kelly, no one could say how it got there. There were no records, no documents, no name in any archive. But the mechanics who found it stood silent for a long moment. They knew they were looking at a ghost's signature, a whisper from the man who had once defied orders to save lives. One of the volunteers, a retired engineer, said quietly, "Whoever he was, he understood airplanes better than the rulebook ever could." That tiny scrap of metal became the centerpiece of the exhibit, labeled Field Mechanic's Note, origin unknown. Visitors would stop and stare, wondering about the nameless man who had left that message in the middle of a war. Back in the United States, Kelly had passed away quietly years before. No medals, no headlines. His death certificate listed his occupation simply as aircraft mechanic. But among the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, his name never faded. At every reunion, Major Robert Cowboy Haynes, older now, walking with a cane, would raise his glass and say, "To Kelly, the man who made the Thunderbolt breathe fire." And every veteran in the room would nod,